Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a haunting mystery of a young farmer's sudden disappearance. 19-year-old DylanRounds vanished from the Utah desert, leaving behind his broken truck, a pair of blood-stained boots, and a shed that may have held answers no one saw at first. The desert out by Lucin does not shout, it whispers. Wind combs grain stubble. A tin shed ticks as it cools. Somewhere out there, a young farmer is supposed to be working, then checking in, then driving home. Instead, there is a red pickup with a cracked window and a silence that does not fit the landscape. The deputy rolls through the dust like a single bead on a long wire road. Family is already there, faces drawn tight by a kind of fear you can taste, metallic, dry. They point to the trailer. They point to the truck. They point to empty spaces where guns should be. A father talks too fast. A mother chooses each word like it might break in her hand. A neighbor steps from the heat shimmer and offers directions no one asked for. He knows the bars in Montello. He knows the rough men. He knows the stories of strong-arm robberies and bad nights. He says the word crime scene before anyone else will. It lands wrong. It hangs there. Then he nods toward the shed, casual as a man showing a tool rack. Boot leather shows up against desert tan, discarded, stained, wrong. Not out here, not like this. The boots look new, then look ruined. The deputy bags them, careful, slow, as if the ground itself might bruise. Overhead, a helicopter trades circles for answers and gets back only the same square miles of scrub and shadow. Out by a little pond, the wind slicks the surface until it is a mirror. Phones die in places like this. Then, sometimes, they do not. Sometimes, they hold on, blinking, recording through a pocket and a smear of dust. Sometimes, devices remember when people are made to disappear. The shed is ordinary in every way you want it to be. Metal, shade, smell of oil and mice. The kind of place a boy parks a grain truck to keep it dry. The kind of place a man can decide what a story will be and how long it will live. Officers step inside because that is their job. They look, they listen, they leave. Out in the glare, the neighbor squints and talks about thieves. Behind them, sheet metal reflects the sun like a closed eye. If the truth is already here, why isn't anyone bleeding yet? But what they are about to find, piece by piece, from boot leather to pond water, will drag this quiet shed into a different kind of light. To understand why DylanRounds' disappearance rattled so deeply, you have to know the boy himself and the men who moved in the same orbit around him. Dylan was only 19, barely out of high school, yet he carried himself with the hard edges of someone twice his age. Farming was not a hobby, not a temporary job. It was his dream, his identity. With his grandfather's help, he had scraped together enough to purchase 640 acres of barren desert land. To others, it looked like dust and sagebrush. To Dylan, it was a future carved by his own hands. People who knew him describe a young man with calloused palms and bright ambition. He talked about wheat yields, irrigation plans, and heavy equipment as if he were building an empire. He lived rough sometimes, alone in a trailer, sometimes bunking at friends' places, but he never lost the spark of determination. His mother said he was stubborn, the kind who would argue about fixing a truck until sunrise, and still head out to the field with grit in his teeth. Yet ambition cuts both ways. Dylan's pride in his independence meant he frequented local bars, talking freely about the money he was investing and the crops he intended to grow. In a town like Montello, scarred by unemployment, petty crime, and the kind of men who measure themselves by intimidation, such talk can draw the wrong eyes. Names like ChaseVenstra surfaced often, men known for theft, for violence, for carrying grudges into the night. Dylan brushed them off, convinced that no one could shake his resolve. Orbiting closer still was James "JimBrenner." In his late 50s, Brenner had a history as dry and brittle as the desert itself. Assault charges, weapons violations. Neighbors whispered about his temper, his unpredictability. Yet to Dylan he appeared as a rough but useful ally, a man with land nearby, tools at the ready, and the willingness to lend a hand. Brenner camped in a trailer near Dylan's property, sometimes helping with chores, sometimes just lingering. To outsiders, it seemed harmless, even generous. But proximity has a way of hiding motives. What did Brenner see in Dylan? Youthful energy he admired, or opportunity he could exploit? The community itself added another layer. Out in Lucene, isolation is not a backdrop. It is the air you breathe. Neighbors are miles apart. Police patrols come late, if at all. People depend on one another, but they also learn to keep secrets, to settle scores quietly. In that kind of silence, Dylan's loud dreams of building a massive farm stood out like a flare. His boots were new, his equipment cost thousands. His talk of profits echoed through bars where desperation sat heavy. Did his determination make him a symbol of hope or a target for envy? When family drove out to the desert and found Dylan gone, those relationships began to shift under scrutiny. The mother's memory of a confrontation with Chase, the father's uneasy truce with Brenner, the whispers about criminals who had threatened others before, all of it formed a web of tension stretching across Dylan's brief life. Somewhere in that web lay the reason he vanished. The question remained, was the danger already woven into his circle, waiting for the right moment? And if so, who among those closest to Dylan carried the darkest thread? The last confirmed sighting of DylanRounds came on a Friday morning in late May 2022. He had called his grandmother, promising he would park the grain truck inside the shed before the rain rolled in. Routine words, a task any farmer knows. But those words would be the last his family ever heard from him. By Saturday, silence replaced habit. No calls, no updates. Concern hardened into alarm. When relatives drove out to the desert to check on him, they found the red Ford parked at an odd angle, its back window broken, the seats sprinkled with glass. The truck looked abandoned, but not wrecked. Too neat to be random, too damaged to be explained away. Inside his trailer, essentials were missing: firearms gone, key fob vanished, the ordinary clutter of life unsettled. Outside, the desert gave up its first secret, a pair of boots, Dylan's size and style, discarded south of the shed. The leather was stained, dark in patches that no rain could cause. Blood, they looked newly placed, almost deliberate. Deputies bagged them, but at that moment, no one could say whether they marked the start of a trail or the abrupt end of one. Neighbors stepped forward with talk. One name surfaced quickly: ChaseVenstra, a drifter with a reputation carved from violence. Witnesses said Dylan had crossed paths with him days earlier, an encounter tense enough that Dylan mentioned it to his mother. Chase was known for thefts, standoffs with police, and bar fights that ended with broken jaws. Easy to believe he could make a young farmer disappear. Easy, maybe too easy. Then there was the neighbor, who seemed eager to steer suspicion. JimBrenner spoke freely about criminals in Montello, spinning tales of robbery and warning deputies to dig there. He even dropped the phrase "crime scene" before any crime was established. Odd, out of place. Yet, in those early days, Brenner was seen as the gruff helper, the man close by who knew the land. Meanwhile, the search widened. Volunteers scoured the desert on foot and horseback. A helicopter traced circles overhead. They found nothing but sagebrush, dirt tracks, and silence. Every hour stretched heavier. The hope of a simple explanation thinning with each pass of rotor blades. The family pressed deputies, pointed to missing items, insisted Dylan would never simply walk away. Investigators followed what leads they had. They moved to question ChaseVenstra, leveraging an old warrant to pull him in. But his arrest brought only denials and bargaining. He claimed knowledge, but demanded freedom in return. Without evidence, his words meant little. He stayed in jail, uncooperative. The case still open. Then came the strange discovery. Dylan's trailer had been disturbed after the initial searches. A gun appeared suddenly, sitting where it had not been hours before. Someone had slipped back, moved things, left clues, or planted them. Whoever it was, they were bold enough to walk into a crime scene, confident enough to believe they would not be caught. Through it all, the desert remained unmoved. Days slid into weeks. The blood on the boots waited in the lab. The family searched. Detectives collected names, rumors, fragments, and still, Dylan himself remained unseen. But the most chilling fact was this. Officers had already walked inside the very shed where the story ended. They stepped through, looked around, and left, unaware that a murder had taken place within those walls. The killer had shown them the scene himself, standing close, pointing at shadows, smiling as if nothing were wrong. The truth was already there, but hidden in plain sight. And the next move's family, digging deeper. The deputies circling suspects, neighbors betraying each other, would ignite an investigation that refused to stay still. In the days after Dylan's disappearance, the investigation moved like a tide forward, then back, then sideways, always chasing fragments. Deputies had Dylan's boots, the blood, the broken truck window, but none of it explained where the boy had gone or why. Detectives first turned their attention toward ChaseVenstra, with his criminal history, his reputation for violence, and the timing of his encounter with Dylan. He looked like the perfect suspect. They moved quickly, arresting him on an unrelated warrant. Under interrogation, Chase denied harming Dylan. Instead, he dangled hints, claiming he knew what had happened, but wanted his gun charges dropped in exchange. Detectives refused. His bargaining failed, and though he remained in custody, there was nothing tangible linking him to Dylan's fate. Meanwhile, Dylan's parents pressed investigators to look elsewhere. They spoke of the unsettling remark made by JimBrenner, the neighbor who had used the words "crime scene" before any crime had been confirmed. At first, deputies brushed it off, but soon, his history surfaced. Prior convictions for assault, weapons charge, and a federal warrant still active. Suddenly, Brenner was not just a talkative neighbor. He was a man with violent habits, living steps away from Dylan's shed. The picture grew darker when Donald Hatley, Brenner's longtime friend, quietly came forward. He admitted Brenner had delivered several firearms to him for safekeeping right after Dylan vanished. To Hatley, it seemed Brenner feared another long prison stay and wanted to protect his property. To detectives, the timing was damning. Why hide weapons days after a young man disappeared? At the same time, lab results arrived. The blood on Dylan's boots was confirmed to be his. More chilling still, touched DNA on the leather matched JimBrenner. The evidence placed him at the very heart of the mystery. Investigators seized Brenner's phone. Its location data betrayed him further, showing his device moving toward a pond near the shed on the day Dylan disappeared. When divers searched the murky water, they retrieved Dylan's phone. Inside, a video clip sealed the trajectory of the case. Brenner, wearing a blood-stained shirt, cleaning a gun. It was not a confession spoken aloud. It was something colder, an accidental record of a killer tidying up. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors weighed their options. They charged Brenner with aggravated murder and firearm possession. But one problem remained: there was still no body. Without Dylan's remains, the case leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. Even if it was damning, months turned into a year. Detectives pushed, interrogated, and waited. Then came the jailhouse breakthrough. A cellmate of Brenner's claimed the older man had confessed, detailing a struggle inside the shed, a bite mark on his hand, and 2 shots from a small caliber gun that ended Dylan's life. According to the cellmate, Brenner had loaded Dylan's body with a backhoe and buried it deep in the desert. The confession fit the evidence: the DNA, the phone data, the bloody boots, piece by piece. The puzzle closed in. Finally, in the spring of 2024, Brenner agreed to a deal. He led law enforcement to the burial site several miles from the grain shed, hidden so well that searchers had unknowingly driven over it before. Only bones and scraps of clothing remained. But for Dylan's family, it was proof. For prosecutors, it was the missing cornerstone. Brenner entered a plea: guilty to second-degree murder and 2 firearm charges. In exchange, prosecutors dropped counts of desecration of a body and an unrelated assault. It was not the full measure of justice some hoped for, but it ensured he would spend years behind bars. And with Brenner secured not, the case turned from a question of who to a courtroom battle of how much guilt could be proven and how much punishment would follow. When JimBrenner finally entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. This was not just another hearing in a small Utah County courthouse. It was the long-awaited reckoning for a disappearance that had haunted the desert for nearly 2 years. Families filled the benches. Dylan's parents, siblings, friends. Some clutched tissues, others simply folded their arms, jaws locked against emotion. Across the aisle sat Brenner, shackled, older than his years, his face set in the mask of a man accustomed to fighting, not yielding. Prosecutors opened with precision. They laid out the timeline: Dylan's last call to his grandmother, the broken truck, the blood-stained boots found yards from the shed. Then came the forensic chain, the DNA linking Brenner to the boots, the phone data leading to the pond, the video of Brenner cleaning a gun while wearing a blood-spattered shirt. Each point was delivered like a nail hammered into wood. They called experts, crime scene analysts, digital forensic specialists, DNA scientists. Each reinforced the picture: no one else's DNA on the boots. No other explanation for the phone's recovery. No innocent reason for Brenner's recorded actions. The prosecution did not rely on spectacle. They relied on the steady weight of evidence pressing down, piece by piece, until there seemed no escape. The defense tried to counter. They argued that Dylan's life was already surrounded by criminals, that others like ChaseVenstra or Robert Ailes had motive and opportunity. They suggested the phone video could be misinterpreted, that Brenner was simply cleaning a weapon he lawfully owned. But their words often sounded hollow against the sheer volume of evidence. Even their cross-examinations faltered. As witnesses calmly repeated their findings, Dylan's family watched in silence, every detail pulling them back into the nightmare. When the boots were lifted for the jury to see, his mother turned away. When the video of Brenner was played, his father clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles blanched. The turning point came with the testimony of Brenner's former cellmate. Calm, deliberate, he described Brenner's confession, how Dylan had bitten his hand, how the struggle ended with shots from a small caliber gun, how the body was buried with a backhoe. The cellmate had nothing to gain, prosecutors argued, except to speak the truth. Jurors leaned forward, listening. By the time closing arguments arrived, the weight of the case was heavy in the room. Prosecutors spoke of betrayal, how Brenner had stood beside the family in early searches, pretending to help, all while knowing the truth. They spoke of arrogance, how he had led deputies into the very shed where he had killed Dylan, confident he would never be caught. The defense asked for doubt. They pointed again to the desert's lawless edges, to other violent men, to the lack of an eyewitness. But the jury had already seen the boots, the phone, the video. They had already heard the confession secondhand, steady and chilling. When the verdict came, it was quiet. Brenner was found guilty of second-degree murder and firearm charges. No dramatic outburst, no collapse. Just a man led away in chains, and a family left with the bitter confirmation of what they had long suspected. And yet, beyond the verdict, the deeper question remained. What kind of man chooses silence and deception over admitting what he has done, and what drove him to turn a neighbor's shed into a tomb? The courtroom verdict answered who killed DylanRounds, but it left another question gnawing beneath the surface. Why? To examine Brenner's choices is to step into the psychology of a man shaped by violence, failure, and isolation. JimBrenner had spent decades drifting through rural towns, always carrying a criminal record behind him like a dust cloud. Assault charges, firearm violations, a reputation for aggression that never seemed to fade. Psychologists would say such patterns rarely form overnight. They are cultivated by years of unchecked anger, impulsivity, and the belief that force is the only language people will listen to. Living in the remote desert amplified those tendencies. Isolation does not calm a volatile man. It sharpens his edges. Brenner lived in a trailer, often alone, clinging to his few possessions, mistrustful of outsiders. When Dylan appeared, a 19-year-old full of energy, talking about profits, building his farm, showing up with new boots and equipment, Brenner may have felt overshadowed. To a man already insecure, Dylan's ambition could look like arrogance. The confrontation described by Brenner's cellmate reveals more. Dylan fired a weapon into the air during a struggle, defiant, refusing to be intimidated. That act might have humiliated Brenner, who was decades older, yet being challenged by someone barely out of high school. Humiliation and rage, for men like him, often ignite into violence. From a legal standpoint, prosecutors argued the murder was opportunistic. Brenner lashed out, then tried to cover his tracks. But beneath the law lies motive shaped by psychology. Brenner may have seen Dylan as a threat not just physically, but symbolically, a reminder of youth, potential, and a future he himself no longer had. To destroy Dylan was, in a twisted sense, to reassert control over a life he felt slipping away. Even his behavior after the killing reflects pathology. Returning to the trailer, moving weapons, planting or hiding evidence. Those are not the actions of a panicked man. They are the behaviors of someone who has long practiced concealment. Someone who assumes he can bend reality if he manages perception. His attempt to point suspicion toward ChaseVenstra fits the same pattern. Project blame outward, muddy the waters, survive another day. For Dylan, the psychology tells a different story. At 19, he embodied optimism and independence. But psychologists warn that young men in isolated communities often underestimate risk, talking openly about money, frequenting bars, trusting volatile neighbors. These behaviors, innocent on the surface, can draw predators. Dylan's stubborn belief in self-reliance, admirable as it was, may have blinded him to danger. The tragedy rests in that intersection: youthful confidence meeting entrenched violence. A teenager dreaming of crops and machinery walked straight into the orbit of a man who could not tolerate being diminished. Legally, the case demonstrated the value of persistence. DNA, digital forensics, and careful prosecution overcame lies and misdirection. Psychologically, It underscored how unchecked aggression, isolation, and resentment can ferment into lethal outcomes. The lesson, if there is one, is not just about Dylan or Brenner. It is about the risk factors communities often overlook: neighbors with histories of violence, men who live in isolation with weapons, people whose anger simmers just out of sight. They are warnings, visible long before tragedy strikes, and in looseness, those warnings were missed until it was far too late. When the sentence was finally handed down, the weight of 2 years collapsed into a single moment. JimBrenner received 1 to 15 years for second-degree murder, plus additional terms for firearm possession. For Dylan's parents, it was justice of a kind, but never enough. No sentence could match the loss of a son. The emptiness left behind on 640 acres of desert land he once dreamed of transforming. The Lucin community reacted with a mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the shadow of suspicion that had stretched across the town had at last narrowed to a single man. Unease, because it took so long. For months, deputies had walked past the shed. Locals had whispered about ChaseVenstra, and the truth had sat within reach. It forced a reckoning, not only with Brenner's violence, but with the blind spots of a community willing to overlook red flags. Nationally, the case resonated. Dylan's story became a cautionary tale carried by news outlets, podcasts, and true crime forums. People debated how a teenager could vanish in plain sight, how evidence could be missed, how a neighbor's criminal history went unchecked. His name was added to a tragic roll call of young lives lost in isolated places, victims of predators hiding behind familiarity. For investigators, the case underscored the power of persistence. DNA testing, digital forensics, patient interrogation, all eventually aligned to break Brenner's lies. The discovery of Dylan's remains gave closure, but also highlighted the brutality of concealment. Even when buried, the truth waits to surface. For Dylan's family, the aftermath is lived in small ways. A mother setting a place at the table she knows will remain empty. A father driving past fields where his son once planned irrigation lines. Each memory is edged with both pride and sorrow. Pride that Dylan fought for independence, sorrow that it ended so violently. Brenner's conviction also left a lingering question for rural America. How many other men with violent pasts live unmonitored on society's edges? How many neighbors hide tempers, guns, and grudges that could ignite under pressure? Dylan's death is a reminder that danger often grows not from strangers in the dark, but from the man already standing beside you, offering help. The desert now carries 2 stories. One is of a young farmer with ambition larger than the horizon. The other is of the man who buried him, thinking the sand would keep secrets. And for every family who listens, the story warns: pay attention to the quiet places, because silence can hide the loudest crimes. The story of Dylan Rounds reminds us of something we often overlook in rural America.